Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 32nd Annual David R. Kessler Lecture. Tonight, we are here to celebrate the achievement of Heather Love. The Kessler Lecture is given to someone who has sustained scholarship in LGBTQ studies, and as far as I'm concerned, Heather is one of the people who has been sustaining our field for many years. So Heather, congratulations. I want to say that helping us at CLAGS tonight introduce Heather are our friends Cindy Patton and Kaji Amin and David Kernick. Before I get going, I just want to say that Heather's work has been important to me, as important as anyone else's in queer studies, and I know I'm not alone when I say that. She has helped me learn about how to work together in our field with integrity and passion and rigor, and when it's most important, with kindness, and I thank you for that. I've followed you to Queer Methods, I've followed you through queer class studies, and through the study of this field formation called Queer and Trans Studies. Heather, thank you for your body of work. My name is Matt Brim. I'm the Executive Director of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, here at the CUNY Graduate Center. CLAGS, as some of you know, is the first university-based research center for the study of LGBTQ people and lives and histories and thought. CLAGS was founded in 1986 by Martin Duberman and a hardy crew of scholars who were really the first people ever to think of themselves as gay and lesbian academics doing gay and lesbian studies. We have all of them to thank. Now, 1986 was not a time when CLAGS was possible, and yet we will have the chance to honor the past of CLAGS much more fully in the next academic year when we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the center. Yeah. More of that to come in the new year. This difficult week that we're in right now, but not only this week, might cause us to ask, is CLAGS still possible? Will it be? Friends, I'm here to tell you good news and bad news. Everyone in the in-person audience here tonight received CLAGS' 2023-24 annual report. For those of you watching online at home, you can follow the link in the chat to our annual report at our website, clags.org. The annual report is filled with good news about CLAGS events and programming, about our fellowships that we offer to emerging scholars in LGBT studies, and about the collaborations we've formed with community partners. I want to update everyone about what we've been up to just this academic year, 24-25. This year, in October, we launched the CLAGS Research Archive, housed here at the Menneries Library at the Graduate Center. And in the CLAGS Research Archive, you can research the history of CLAGS as an organization, and thereby research the history of LGBTQ studies. The archive is open to everybody. It's a public archive. You just need to make an appointment. Also, later this year, in March of 2025, we're going to launch the Amber Hollabaugh Seminars in the city. Some of you will remember and may have participated in the Seminars in the City, which has traditionally been CLAG's public education program. We lost Amber Hollabaugh, a Kessler winner, last October, but in her honor, And with the co-sponsorship of the Barnard Center for Research on Women, we are launching the seminars again. If you go to our website, you will see that there's a call for proposals in case you want to be an instructor of the seminars. I think that those proposals are due November 15th, so you don't have very long, but you can go to our website if you would like to do that. And finally, starting this spring, CLAGS is proud to coordinate an advanced certificate in LGBTQ studies, the only kind of certificate in our area. We've just received approval from CUNY and from the state, and we're working hard to get the program up and running. You can email lgbtqstudies@gc.cuny.edu for more information about that program, which will soft launch in the spring of 2025. And finally, as we always do, CLAGS is charging ahead with innovative and cutting-edge programming. We have 2 speaker series this year I want to mention: Queer Globalizations, which is headed up by Margot Weiss, and Power of Leather, which is headed up by Cassandra Sparks and Laura Westengard. If you go to our website or to our link tree, you'll find information about how to register for those wonderful speaker series. So this and more is the good news I bring you about CLAGS tonight. It's an incredibly auspicious beginning to the year, and I'm so proud of our board for working so hard to make this year, get it off to such a good start. The bad news is that in this blue state of New York, CLAGS is expected, going forward, to do our work with 0% of our operating budget coming from the state. We enjoy this very strong support of the Graduate Center where we're housed and its president, Josh Brumberg, and we love being in this space and contributing to the life of the mind of the Graduate Center and CUNY. However, in order to be self-sustaining, as we are told we must, we need your help. CLAGS is the first, as I said, and oldest LGBTQ research center of its kind in the US. Nevertheless, today the question arises once again, is CLAGS possible? Will it be? Well, tonight we're starting an end-of-the-year fundraiser. For those of you in the audience, you'll know that when you came in, you were given a pledge card and an envelope with your program. On the front of that pledge card, you'll see CLAG's shorthand version of our mission. We believe in free, accessible LGBTQ studies for everyone. If you're joining us, to live up to this mission of providing free and accessible LGBTQ studies to everyone, we need your support. Please, for those in the audience, take a moment to fill out your pledge card. You can include cash or a check, and there's information on the pledge card about the exact way to make out a check. You don't make it to CLAGS, so be sure if you have your checkbook with you to pay attention to the instructions on the pledge card. Please drop your pledge cards in the boxes you'll see at the donation stations, either out in the hall in the lobby of the Elabash or on the concourse level at the reception that we invite you to after the Kessler. If you are joining tonight online, you can go to our giving page, and you'll find the link in the chat. For those who are in the room, you can also go to our giving page if you scan the QR code on the pledge card you got. Our giving page allows you to donate any amount you want, but this year we're trying something new. You'll also see an option for helping CLAGS by becoming a peer-to-peer fundraiser. Simply click Start Fundraising to begin reaching out to your networks on our behalf, telling CLAG's story and ensuring our future. I invite everyone to follow CLAGS on Insta at CLAGSNY and to like and boost and post our stories there. To get you, to help you, to incentivize you to give tonight, we have some gifts. We have swag. First, we secured $1,500 in matching pledges to incentivize giving, meaning that if we raise $1,500 here tonight or over the next 2 weeks after the Kessler, Our donors will give us $1,500 so that we'll actually have raised $3,000, and that's great incentive. Second, to incentivize your generosity tonight, we have swag. We have, for $25, donate $25, and you will receive this very sexy CLAGS tote. It's mesh on the back, right? For $100, you'll receive the sexy tote, and it's a little bright on the stage right now, but you'll receive a limited edition custom print of advertising the event tonight, signed by Heather Love. And I want to thank printmaker Austin Svedjan for creating and donating this limited edition poster. And I want to tell you just a little bit about it. Austin is a graduate student at UPenn and also a studio printmaker at the Common Press. And Austin writes that the poster was completed at the Common Press, and it was made using letterpress printing techniques on 3 machines: an R. Ho & Company Washington press, a Vandercook No. 4 press, and a Vandercook SP15. It's getting a little hot in here. While some of the poster, including the orange background and black sections in the middle, were made by pressure printing on acrylic blocks or with linocut, the majority was made using historical wooden type that was set and manipulated on the press. You'll see these prints outside. They're really beautiful. Austin, thank you so much for making and donating them to CLAGS. You're doing exactly what we need folks to do, which is helping us tell our story with talents that you have. We really appreciate it, Austin. For $150, you'll get the sexy tote, and you'll get all of the Kessler lectures from 1992 to 2020 that we have collected in 2 volumes, Queer Ideas, and this is the first edition of Queer Ideas, Kessler Lectures 1992 to 2002, and just published last year by the Feminist Press, as they both are, Queer Then and Now. And this is the Kessler Lectures from 2002 to 2020. So for $150, you get the tote and these books. For $200, you get a sexy tote, you get the books, and you get the sexy poster that Austin made for us. While they last. This is limited edition. And finally, for $500, you get all of the above, plus we have 2 of these. A signed copy of Stonewall by Martin Duberman, signed by Marty. And if you donate, we just have 2 of these. If you donate $500, you'll get all of those gifts. Those in person with us tonight can go to the donation stations in the lobby or downstairs in the concourse. And if you give online, we'll ship your gifts to you. Just to close, last year, you should know that individual donations were CLAG's greatest source of income. And we can't thank you enough, and I can't emphasize enough that while the circumstances around us asking for your support are, on the one hand, ugly, it's nevertheless an enormous privilege to ask for you to help us, to ask for you to share CLAG's mission. My promise as an executive director is that CLAGS will do our best to never be, we never want to be, self-sustaining, and that is because you sustain us. And we do our best to bring you programming and events and thoughts and speakers that will sustain you in this world. To point toward Heather's lecture, this is a very intimate relationship, and it helps us build a future together. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your money. Thank you for sharing CLAG's mission. It's now my privilege to introduce Laura Westengard to get the evening started. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Matt, and thanks to all of you for being here today, both in person and online. I just received an exciting update. We have just received a $250 donation from former CLAGS Executive Director Sarah Chin. Thank you, Sarah. We would love if others who have been on the CLAGS board or part of our events also considered giving to the fundraiser this evening. I'm here to introduce our first testimonial speaker, Cindy Patton, sociologist, public health activist, media scholar, and it turns out, avid cyclist. I can't ride a bike, so I might ask you for tips later. Now, I'm a professor of English literature. I'm researching a book on medical history, writing about 18th century Gothic fiction and contemporary queer art and performance, and I'm gonna be the coordinator of the new LGBTQ Studies program here at the Graduate Center. So for me personally, Dr. Patton has been a beacon of interdisciplinarity. Starting out in journalism long ago, and then producing field-changing work on the social and political aspects of AIDS, film, the history of sexuality, porn, bioethics, Taiwan studies, and more. It's also notable that Dr. Patton's writing walks that delicate line between academic rigor and popular accessibility. In other words, the work is both meticulously researched and theorized and eminently readable. This is a balance that I wish more writers mastered, to be honest. She's also prolific. I only have 2 minutes, so I can't name all the publications, but her work on AIDS with books such as Inventing AIDS and Sex and Germs and Globalizing AIDS, that work has been incredibly influential across disciplinary boundaries. So I am thrilled and inspired to introduce our first testimonial speaker, Dr. Patton, tonight. Thank you.
Happen to you someday. Our event today takes place on land that performs historical erasure in its very name, Manhattan, derived from a toponym used by the traditional users of this land, the Lenape. As children, many of us were given pictures of the acquisition of this land. The famous painting shows large white men giving what were always described as trinkets in exchange for the land that they believed was held by specific individuals. A history that is long debunked, and I hope no longer taught to children. What remains, though, is the myth of an economic transaction that still inheres in the reproduction of American economic and political morality. The mean streak in the American psyche is that fooling people is the way to get ahead. A zero-sum framework that has produced a social and political reality. In agitating one structure of shame and stigma into a violent and fevered pitch, the new fascism copied the rhetoric and social movement logics of the more obvious objects of American hate: people of color, First Nations, queers, women, the newly arrived. The people whose new social movements gradually resulted in the modest increase in social justice that we saw by the early years of the 21st century. My land acknowledgement today, then, is an attempt not only to acknowledge a place, but also to remind us of the role of representations of history in the construction of the heart of politics here and now. Professor Heather Love's work partakes in this rethinking of what we inherit. Her long record of academic publication and her public engagement in interviews, talks, and podcasts is remarkable for its coherence, clarity, and yes, for its slightly contrarian stance. In her recent book, Underdogs, Heather explores the elisions, collisions, and missed opportunities of what we might call a big tent version of queer theory that includes all the academic disciplines. Well, maybe not neurobiology. Of course, Heather's not trained as a social scientist, as unenthusiastic reviewers immediately pointed out. But for me, this is by no means a disqualification for undertaking the 15-year-long deep dive into Goffman, which extended into the figures she found within the nexus of what she calls or understands as interactional microsociology. In this work, she's guided by three ideas. First, to quote her, queer studies turn descriptive study of deviance into a normative injunction to be deviant. Second, of course, is her career-long interest in the outmoded, the outdated, the emotional register of backwardness. And the third guiding principle is her capacity for self-criticism and reevaluation of her own earlier work. In Underdogs, she writes, "I can see now that I overstated my difference from Cedric, kicking up a fuss in order to be part of the conversation. Cedric's queer performativity celebrates shame's transformative potential while acknowledging that its actual transformation is never guaranteed. Disagreeing with Cedric helped me formulate an approach to queer literary history that centered negative and painful feelings. If at one time I thought it was a difference in politics or temperament, I can see now how it emerged from a disciplinary history." I admire Heather's willingness to recognize the petulant side of her former academic self. This is exceptionally rare in any field, much less in a field that is more or less founded upon petulance. Her growing sense of her possibly misaimed motives drove her to understand the contours of a field outside of her original training. In that decade and a half of research and autodidactic retraining, she brings that early concept of backwardness into contact with a field that was quite foreign to her. She leverages her interest in the dated to rethink the long-standing question of the relationship of queer theory and gay studies before it to the institution of higher education. Echoing Bourdieu's work on class mobility and academics as a group, in Underdogs, Heather hopes to bring into greater ethical focus the effect of, quote, the split identity of queer scholars as people who identify as outsiders to sexual norms, to the academy, but who are also insiders, implicated in converting deviance into a deliverable in the modern research university. Now, Heather's pathway here was not a predictable one. Raised like so many of us in the Mid-South, in a place whose class structure is inflected by the history of racism in the slave system, but also by the era of Reconstruction that converted the racial project of black enslavement into the racial project of white resentment that lingers today in the MAGA movement. Hers was a family of drivers, quite literally. Her paternal grandfather helped tame the post-World War II driving craze when he wrote the first Florida Examiner's Manual. And this love of driving set Heather and her family on a long road trip across America, and then set her on the path of truck driving, which extended from delivering furniture in her family's store in Louisville, Kentucky, to a rather long gap year after she graduated with her BA from Harvard. During that time, she once again delivered furniture. But at some point, her boss discovered her academic credential. On the common assumption made by those outside of our little world, he misrecognized a skill set that someone from a fancy humanities department might have, and he said, "Oh, you went to Harvard, then you can help me with my accounting." The first time I heard Heather mention her family's furniture business in Louisville, I also had a moment of misrecognition. The Heather I knew by then had an Ivy League BA, a Southern Ivy League PhD, and was teaching at another Ivy League school. I therefore assumed that the furniture Heather had delivered was some sort of high-end, master-crafted Danish modern. But no, her family store was a different kind of forerunner, a discount warehouse that promised the striving lower middle class access to a version of what was imagined as modern, and for a cheap price, and on a credit plan that allowed for immediate delivery. Those of you on the older side will remember that before the proliferation of credit cards, we were taught a kind of paradoxical economic prudery through things like layaway plans, in which your purchase was held, physically held, in a place until you had made enough monthly payments to receive it. a system for leveraging the small disposable income of strivers into the larger consumer economy. In fact, Heather's family was not only a part of that new economy, but they were also local celebrities in the new world of cable television advertising, where once again, those who did not have means to buy mainstream advertising could produce their own ads in the public access studios that were originally mandated by the inaugural cable television regulations. In fact, there's a YouTube channel devoted to ads from Louisville, which features furniture liquidator saving you more. An ad that ran weekly for decades. Now, I've watched many of these, and I can say the glory and shame of watching and apparently sometimes featuring in these zany ads underlies Heather's attraction to a class of backward things. And I'm sure that the weekly effort she observed in her family of coming up with new hooks is manifest in her adult practice of searching for things that others have left aside. It is this practice that drives Heather's ability to identify transversal paths that might be not a way forward, but a way out. And so I close with Heather's own final words, words which include words that she chose from Sarah Ahmed. The closing of Underdogs goes like this. Queer sensitivity to stigma is not only a personal trait, but a professional inheritance. Acknowledging this inheritance underlies how deep the challenges facing queer politics are. Yet despite these challenges, the queer dream persists that, Heather says in Ahmed's words, quoting Ahmed, experience of a proximity to one kind of stigma can create a sensitivity to other kinds. End of the Ahmed quote. It is hard to let go of this dream, Heather writes, because it contains the knotted histories of other people's stigma and our own. But we also refuse to let go because the promise of that sensitivity will give way to solidarity. The concept of stigma has so far failed to create a truly collective movement, but the experience of stigma keeps this dream alive. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Dr. Patton. That was so beautiful. Well, I'll continue on in the tradition of family advertisement here. So, good news is we are at $535. Thank you to everyone who donated. Look, we need, and I learned this from Black queer writer, philosopher Elaine Locke, we need endowed spaces for queer studies, for trans studies. We don't have them. Black queer studies are facing attacks from everywhere, so we need you. So $10, we love $25. And just $25, all of you here and online will give us, you know what, $12,000 tonight. That means so many great public programming, free, accessible. So think about that, and as you sit with that possibility, I'm going to do the best thing, and that is I am so thrilled and honored to introduce you to Dr. Kaji Amin. Well, I am Deborah D. Biswas, Assistant Professor of African American Studies at CUNY's New York City College of Technology. I'm also the co-chair of CLAGS' Board of Directors. But Dr. Kaji Amin is Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Emory University, and also visiting Associate Research Professor in the program for the study of women, gender, and sexuality at Johns Hopkins University. Or should I say, as Kaji Amin teaches us, women's gender-sexuality studies. Well, Kaji is the author of Disturbing Attachments, Genet, Modern Pederasty and Queer History from Duke University Press, 2017. He has many, many awards. I can go on, but I'll say that his capacious oeuvre urges us to examine Western queer theory's attachments to an idealized, romanticized understanding of queer and trans as anti-normative and therefore already liberated from the colonial materiality that shapes the so-called others. But did you ever wonder who was that rare peer reviewer of your bold and radical article who didn't banish your ideas to the trash bin of academia with a certain rudeness that ends up costing you hours of therapy? Well, to spill the tea, it was probably Kaji Amin. And I speak from experience. Kaji's peer review work for our WSQ special issue, Unbearable Beings, that I recently co-edited with my comrade, Laura Westengard here, taught us that peer review is care work. Means we are all non-binary. A brief history of accidents has been very generative and useful in helping me understand that one, gender and sexuality are indissociable, gender-sexuality, that is. And gender is a material, social form of being and not some atomized psychic feeling that just is and doesn't need to be with one another to realize itself. I will end by quoting Kaji. Western history of gender-sexuality, quote, has been the history of the burial of gender deeper and deeper within the private recesses of the self, where it increasingly disavows any relation to the social, end quote. Now more than ever, we have to be with one another and fight without hope, fight with hope, but fight absolutely. Kaji Amin, it is my pleasure to welcome you.
Well, thanks, Debarati, for that rollicking introduction. and I could say that I couldn't be happier to be here today or more honored to be celebrating Heather's work and contributions to queer studies. Encountering Heather's work was a watershed in my own trajectory as a scholar. It was 2013, I was a new hire at SUNY Stony Brook, and I was on my way to Columbia University for the Thinking Feminism at the Limits conference. In 2013, queer studies was settling into its groove, both comfortable in its categorical repudiation of normativity in all of its forms, and ambitious in its expansion of queer inquiry into any number of new directions. The key was the field's proclamation that, as a form of subjectless critique, it had no necessary connection to the limiting, unimaginative, and frankly rather suspect objects of sex, sexuality, and homosexuality. As the beneficiary of a new assistant professor of queer studies tenure-track job, I took these precepts to be unmitigated goods. I was upended then to hear Heather call the field to task in her talk that day. Queer Theory's Everything Problem, the title of Heather's talk, which she was kind enough to share with me afterwards, took aim at what I understood to be the field's most enabling claim, its understanding of itself as, and I quote from the talk, against limits, without limits, beyond limits. In my own flight from stuffy French literature departments, I had been drawn to the field's transgressiveness. To the young scholar that I then was, queer studies gleamed with promise. It was not a discipline. It did not dictate its object or method. It seemed sophisticated and stylish. And best of all, it was full of homosexuals. As a lover of homosexuals of all varieties, I strongly felt that this was the field for me. Sometimes fields don't deliver on their promises. Today, in 2024, my youthful enthusiasm must seem quaint to younger scholars. After watching the nation's top universities send police to violently arrest their own students as they took a principled stance against the genocide in Gaza and called for their institutions to divest from occupation, it is hard to be so naive as to think that any product of an academic institution could truthfully claim to be radical and transgressive. And in fact, the very qualities that drew me to queer studies were indicative of the field's contradictions. How to square, for example, the field's expansive assertion that it had no necessary object, no necessary relation to sexuality, with the fact that most work in it did have some relation to sexuality, especially homosexuality, and that most scholars within it were lesbian or gay. And what about the contradictions between the field's claims to political radicalism and the not radical politics of most gays and lesbians? I am hesitant, Heather admitted that day, about articulations that so categorically refuse sexual subcultures as objects who are not adequate to our politics. Those words searingly diagnosed the trouble I was encountering while writing Disturbing Attachments in attempting to address, within a queer theoretical idiom, aspects of Jean Genet's erotics and politics that, while quintessentially queer, as in mid-century sexual underground, never quite attained the utopian political horizon queer also signified. What was the relation between these two senses of the term queer? And what should one name as queer when, if you really thought about it, just about everything was a little bit queer, and just about nothing was truly radically queer? For a field putatively lacking in norms, you sure did have to be an insider to know how to do something so basic as know how to use the field's key term. Queer theory's everything problem closed, concretely enough, with a 6-point plan for the field. Heather enjoined us to, and I'm gonna quote from the talk, 1, question anti-normativity. 2, acknowledge the institutional/professional situation of the field. 3, risk having an object, if not gender and sexual minorities, then gender and sexuality. 4, risk an engagement with the empirical. 5, risk description, because sometimes description, accounting for deviance in the social world, is as important as forming accounts of how we should live. And 6, politics of refusal, accept its failures, its weaknesses. I'll let you judge how much this program has aged. As I reviewed it for this testimonial, I was struck by the extent to which these tenets became foundational, not only for Disturbing Attachments, but also for the book I'm writing today on transmaterialism without gender identity. Many of you here will recognize in Heather's program a succinct condensation of lessons for the field from her most recent book, Underdogs. In 2013, though, Queer Theory's Everything Problem was the only internal critique I knew that did not just enjoin the field to queer itself further. I was shocked by the talk, the kind of shock that wakes you up as if from a dream, making you look around and wonder, are you really allowed to say that out loud? My shock was matched only by the thrill of sensing that something had been jostled open, that, thanks to Heather, it was now possible to think, speak, and write in ways that had hitherto seemed impossible. Heather herself would be the first to admit that Queer Theory's Everything Problem was not the first work to critique the disciplinary foundations of queer theory. She later recommended to me early cautions by scholars such as Lisa Dugan and Brian Epps. I soon discovered that there were many scholars who quietly, without making a fuss, exited the field when it became clear that gay and lesbian history and culture would not be its objects. Later, I would discover the critiques of scholars outside of the field who assessed that queer theory was just deconstruction and, disappointed, moved on. But what interested me the most were the concerns of scholars whose work never became central within the field, likely because their commitment to empirical methods prevented them from making the kind of grandiose theoretical claims that garner attention and acclaim. My shock at the proposals that closed Queer Theory's Everything Problem marked 2 aspects of my own scholarly itinerary. First, the fact that as a newcomer to the field, I had not been party either to the early descent by gay and lesbian studies scholars that marked the field's birth, or to the quiet exodus of many first-generation queer studies scholars from the field. And second, my near total formation by queer humanistic rather than social scientific or historical scholarship. Had I been a more empirical scholar, my reaction to Queer Theory's Everything Problem would likely have been, well, duh, or finally. As Underdogs explains at length, the basic claims, methods, and values that ground empirical scholarship have long been anathema in queer theory, where empiricism is widely caricatured as positivism, description as rote and lacking in skill, and knowledge itself as suspect. At worst, queer theory's humanistic hermeneutics of suspicion can amount to a refusal to know anything, which, when applied to minoritized life, culture, and history, can be downright genocidal. Heather was not the first scholar to do this truth-telling, but she was the first celebrated contemporary scholar of queer studies to do so. This use of her position in the field is important. It opened the way for other scholars, including myself, to take stock of the field as an academic field and to tell our own, sometimes difficult, truths about it. As Heather has so expertly demonstrated, queer studies is a strange beast of a field, with its fabled birth out of 1990s AIDS activism, its high theoretical, deconstructive, and psychoanalytic pedigree, and its supersession and cannibalization of both gay and lesbian studies and the mid-century social science of deviance. Nonetheless, many of the insights of Underdogs are portable to trans studies, which has often been analogized to the twin of queer studies. While working on my current book, I've been shocked and appalled to discover how little we know as a field about even very recent trans history. With a few important exceptions, in the place of history, we have been bequeathed twin fables about the radicalism of transgender activism and the evils of transsexual medicine. Upon further scrutiny, I found both fables to be composed of telling omissions, anti-transsexual propaganda, and outright lies. If Dugan could write of the queer theoretical turn to textual analysis in 1994, the impressive expansion of increasingly sophisticated analyses is balanced precariously atop a stunted archive, then the empirical research base for contemporary trans studies scholarship is, for the most part, just missing. The field's seeming inability to know anything about trans people, specifically transsexuals, outside of wild idealization and contemptuous dismissal, has rendered trans studies almost completely irrelevant in the face of contemporary attacks on trans people's access to medical transition. I have watched my partner, historian Jules Gill Peterson, take on nearly the entire burden for the field of giving interviews, intervening in public debates, and even writing the historical brief with the help of Lori Marhofer for a case defending medical transition before the Supreme Court. She has been able to serve this urgent role as a public scholar because part of being a historian is a commitment to finding things out that others don't know. This disciplinary orientation could not be more distant from the humanities' theoretical commitment to suspicion, which cohabitates strangely with a willingness to accept as truth theoretical claims with no basis in evidence, both commitments that Underdogs lays bare for us. Heather's work has made way for me to ask a series of pointed questions of the field of trans studies. Namely, how can we theorize trans anything, including trans feminism or Black trans feminism, when we know next to nothing about trans people past and present, including how they lived, how they transitioned, what they desired, and how they were divided by material differences of race, class, gender, and sexuality. I fear that the field's attempt to follow in the footsteps of queer studies by converting trans into an ontologically transgressive gerund or verb dooms it to repeat a queer theoretical itinerary whose limitations Heather has so persuasively analyzed. Heather is a scholar I deeply admire and, admittedly, seek to model myself after, one who, out of a deep commitment to a field, and more importantly, to the subculture from which a field was born, has the courage to puncture some of the fictions that field has woven around itself. My ambition is to take on Heather's position as truth teller and carry on her invaluable work translating between empirical and humanistic habits of thought. For this Kessler Award marks the landmark decision to honor Heather for a new scholarly honesty, or what Christopher Chitty would call a queer realism within queer studies that she has made possible. Thank you.
Hi. That was amazing. I mean, you know, I don't want to follow it, but I'm gonna. To remind you all that we have raised $1,220, and that's credit to you. So let's keep going. Let's keep it going, because really, we need your support, and it is incredibly important, and it's beneficial, and thank you for your donations. They matter a ton. I do this a lot, this sort of introduce the people thing, and so I feel like I know how to do the thing where I tell you that I'm about to introduce David Koenig, who I think you maybe already know, right? Because like, you know Empty Houses, Theoretical Failure in the Novel, like you know sort of that David is a professor at Rutgers whose research and teaching focuses on the history of the novel and theory of the novel, narrative theory, sexuality and gender, all those things. I don't want to do that. What I want to do instead is just like offer some commentary from the students who've experienced him from his Rate My Professor. Yes? Are we living your nightmare? Awesome professor, keeps the class interesting in lecture, has a great sense of humor, probably one of the best teachers at Rutgers. I did not mind attending his lectures at all. Wait for it. First off, he's great to look at. And also, he's hilarious. That doesn't take away from the fact that he's also a great professor. I learned a lot. I think we're all going to learn a lot. I'm so excited to introduce David Koenig.
Okay, all right. This is a little goofier than the other one, so thank you for that introduction. It's an honor and a trip to be introducing Heather's Kessler lecture. It's an honor because Heather is who she is, and because my co-testimonialists are, like her, such major figures in the ongoing endeavor of the study of sexuality and gender. It's a trip because the Kessler is pretty much the same age as my friendship with Heather. We met just over 30 years ago in the summer of 1994 at a party where, according to my memory, she was wearing thrift store jodhpurs. I mention this not just to brandish my bona fides as a long-standing friend, but also because that specific time span is so central to Heather's intellectual and professional life. I don't think we quite knew at the time that CLAGS itself had opened not so long before. We certainly knew that the intellectual project that was starting to be called Queer Studies, and with which the Center and the Kessler have been so identified, was just getting off the ground. At that time, Heather was working in a furniture store, not Furniture Liquidators, but a later furniture store in Cambridge, Mass. And graduate school was a glint in her eye. It seemed pretty conjectural and even a little bit funny, the idea that she might get a PhD and be a writer and maybe even make a career, thinking about what we then always called gay stuff. I think we still do call it that. My memory is that we talked about everything, but also that all we ever really talked about was gay stuff. One snowy winter night in 1995 at a queer bar in far upstate New York, we danced to a Boy George song, not one of his best, that vindicated queer love with a chorus proclaiming weirdly, "It's the same thing in reverse." Nothing better, nothing worse. It's the same thing in reverse. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. We amused ourselves a lot by pretending that we heard the lyrics as "It's the same thing, only worse." The amended chorus made the song suddenly feel true. Being queer exposed you to the full range of human experience, to be sure, only it was harder and sometimes a bit embarrassing and stupid, and the music was often kind of crappy. Of course, we danced until closing. I won't say that Feeling Backward, Heather's first book, was born that night, but I do associate that landmark book with that club and that song. Anyway, It's the Same Thing, Only Worse was very much in the water in which we swam. That joke was a lifesaver for me, getting at aspects of being a homo that the discourse of pride couldn't really touch. For me, this was all pretty inchoate, but everyone here knows what Heather made of that kind of intuition. When Feeling Backward appeared in 2007, the world was a decade and a half into the advent of queer theory as a serious area of academic study. That book, as all of you know, was immediately recognized for the unique piece of deeply felt scholarship that it was. The core argument, as you also know, was that the utterly understandable emphasis of LGBTQ politics on historical recovery and celebration had missed a bunch of emotions that were equally salient in queer life but harder to avow or think through. Shame, loneliness, despair, self-contempt, ambivalence about sex, love, community, all these deserved attention, not just as the roadblocks to queer self-acceptance that they were, but also as complex sources of artistic and political power. The central achievement of this book, sympathetically and brilliantly reading a series of queer culture heroes for their ambivalence about their queer status, was exciting enough in its counterintuitive panache. but Feeling Backward was equally impressive as a work of intra-community diplomacy. The book involved Heather in a series of disagreements, not only with some of the founding assumptions of gay, lesbian, and feminist studies, but also with some of the more recent luminaries of a nascent queer studies, a lot of the first names to appear on the Kessler roster, in other words. Heather's method was to extend the same uncannily sympathetic attitude to the critics and theorists she treated as to the objects of her literary analysis. Her disagreements with her immediate and much admired precursors could never be mistaken for the one-upsmanship or professional jockeying that characterizes a lot of argumentation in the academy. Her later remarks on Sedgwick notwithstanding, I think. Heather wrote palpably from a place of empathy and identification with the critics who, she delicately pointed out, sometimes idealized the queer past or their own critical motives. That empathy made the book not only a bracing intellectual experience, but an absorbing emotional one, and it was justly celebrated for the tonal complexity it introduced into the passionate project of queer studies. Feeling Backward modeled what our criticism could look like if we countenanced negativity rather than repressed it, took on board and sat with, as we say, the disappointment and fear and sadness that are some of the unavoidable dividends of historical and contemporary homophobia. Just as important as this academic intervention, though, is how accessible its emotional tone made the book to students and non-academic readers with little or no interest in such disciplinary questions. Every time I've taught the book's introduction to undergrads, I'm told by several of them that it's their clear favorite of the course. The frequency with which it is cited in their final papers tells me that its popularity extends well beyond those who go out of their way to inform me of their appreciation. It turns out that It's the Same Thing, Only Worse is a song a lot of people need to hear. It's a testament to the restlessness of Heather's intelligence that as soon as the distinctly empathic achievement of Feeling Backward was behind her, she began to question the limits of empathy as a mode of cultural analysis. Alert to the ways that critical stances are imbued with ethical and political projections, she began to explore the possibilities in literature and in criticism of a neutral gaze, one that would resist the indulgence of writerly feeling to offer a more precise registration of the visible, audible, and formal aspects of the world. Her first and still influential exploration of this terrain was her 2010 essay on Toni Morrison's Beloved. The novel emerged in Heather's analysis not only as a richly imaginative inhabitation of the experience of enslavement, but as an experiment in the flat registration of historical tragedy, most notably in the infanticide at the novel's center. Heather noticed that the scene is rendered in a deliberately emotionless and objective idiom, and argued that Morrison's concern for historical justice was served at crucial moments not by protestations of narrative empathy, but by the ability to observe and record without affect the most brutal historical crimes. The continuity with Heather's earlier work is palpable. She is once again asking readers to face distressing material we might prefer to evade. But there was also a profound shift in her account of the observer's self-presentation. This new work expressed serious doubts about how the role of witness can encourage self-aggrandizing fantasies, a judgment she more or less explicitly avowed that could be laid against her own earlier work. To make the drama of this move as clear as possible, Heather's powers of empathy as a friend and reader are pretty off the charts, so it was a startling development to see her renounce them, even as a thought experiment, as she turned her attention to a host of narrative and observational techniques that depended on the recorder's self-erasure. She found evidence of this tactic in literary texts like Claudia Rankine's Citizen and Patricia Highsmith's The Price of Salt, and most radically, she also began to look far beyond the discipline of literary studies. She embarked on a years-long effort to immerse herself in the methods of sociological research, rethinking her approach to cultural analysis from the ground up. The book that resulted, Underdogs, offered a new genealogy for some of the signal arguments and orientations of queer studies. It's a challenge to the field that Heather, with her decades-long commitment to it, is uniquely positioned to issue. For anyone with a feel for Heather's personality, that is, for any of her readers, this turn to impersonality was a complex one, with perhaps some melancholia attached. It turns out that it's not that easy to evade the effects of person, and Underdogs, with its valorization of the erased observer and its ethical non-interventionism, is an unavoidably ethical book. One of the signal moments from the history of ethology she brings to our attention is Nico Tinbergen's use of a hide, essentially a box with a peephole in it, to observe the behavior of seagulls on a beach. Heather ingeniously compares this to Laud Humphrey's practice in his notorious book Tea Room Trade, where he was a participant observer in the public bathroom cruising grounds. He was hiding, Heather writes, not only from his research subjects, but also with them. The comparison is designed to help us see the surprising investment of queer projects in forms of objectivity, but it also helps us see how invested objectivity can be. Notwithstanding Underdog's exaltation of self-absencing, Heather is palpably in there and with us in this book. The particular intersection between the personal and the impersonal is one subject of her current research, but it's also an intersection that any of us who know Heather live at, between the voice on the page, the figure in the profession, and the person we know. I've been watching some of the testimonials for the Kessler recently, and a common thread is a bit of a roast flavor. Stories from the past, glimpses behind the curtain. I've dabbled in that already, and I could offer more. I do have stories about a paper she wrote as an undergrad that was so smart, her teacher said she might be the next Paul Deman. That was in the comments. The essay was an analysis of a Tennyson poem, and it was called Mouth on the Cleft, the paper, not the poem. A fact that almost made us pee our pants laughing when we read it together a few years after she graduated. I have stories about her love for Fleetwood Mac and Janis Ian and Phoebe Snow, and for Barbra Streisand's legendary duets of 1980 with Barry Gibb. And I have choreography to go with a lot of it. I did not get a picture of the Jodhpurs, but I do have in my home photographic evidence of Heather in a full-body party suit, terry cloth party suit, sorry, and a picture of her in a gingham dress, and one where she's wearing Holden Caulfield-style hunter's cap and holding a cucumber to her chin thoughtfully, like a founding father with a quill pen. There are connections to be drawn between the sensibility these stories and images reveal and the work she's done, but I decided not to tell those stories or to project those pictures. The purpose of such anecdotes is to show you some offstage version of the writer, to reveal the real person behind the poise of the work, often a silly or relatable person. But you already know that about Heather. Her sense of humor, which all of this is really about, is the most unmistakable part of her personality as a friend, but also as a writer and a teacher. I don't mean wit, although Heather has it to spare. I mean the sense that she can see through pretense and meet you on the other side of it. It's not a terribly widespread characteristic in academia or in the world. But whether we're located in the university or elsewhere, we're here because we're all in some way Heather's grateful readers or her fortunate students. No better writer, no better teacher from whom to learn about the ways political, intellectual, and emotional commitments when they're working are utterly impossible to disentangle. Thanks, Heather.
On behalf of CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, I present this award. The 2024 David R. Kessler Award is presented to Heather K. Love for her contributions to the field of LGBTQ studies. Congratulations, Heather. Come on up.
Yeah, I'll keep this with me. Thank you so much. That was like a crazy fantasy. And that was just wonderful to hear from you. So thank you, Kaji, thank you, David, thank you, Cindy. And thank you to CLAGS for making this all possible, giving me the award, which, my friendship with David does go back this far, but basically my adulthood coincides with the Kessler lecture, and it's been so important to me every year. I've always been aware of it, come to many, and so on. So it's a trip to be up here. Okay. So do you guys want to hear a paper now? Yeah? I sort of feel like we should go party now because that was so amazing. But I will give a talk now, and you can see whether it measures up to all of this truth-telling and so on. Okay. All right. Can I get some water? by the way? Or just when you get a chance? Oh, wait, no rush. All right, I'll start. Okay, I don't want that to happen. Okay, there are obvious reasons why infrastructure is on everyone's mind these days. Those reasons are called Katrina, Sandy, Nargis, Maria, Harvey, Ian, and Helene. The feminist sociologist Susan Lee Starr once argued that while infrastructure normally goes unremarked by its users, that it becomes visible when it breaks. Increasing weather volatility, the hollowing out of federal bureaucracy, the spectacle of aging and failing public works, and the fragility of public health systems has brought infrastructure topside. And living with ongoing disinvestment on a warming planet, we're just getting started. In the face of such massive threats, humanity's engagements, like this one, with the question of infrastructure may seem quixotic at best. Wouldn't it be better to leave infrastructure to the civil engineers, architects, and city planners? However, it is in the nature of infrastructure that it involves every one of us. But infrastructure and intimacy, and that was a little bit of a joke, but actually, Bruce Robbins, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, saw me on the way, and he was like, okay, infrastructure, but infrastructure and intimacy? Just like the quoted the line from my talk without knowing it. So, yeah, infrastructure and intimacy. So, sex under bridges and in back seats notwithstanding, the relation between intimacy and infrastructure can be hard to picture. Infrastructure is big, intimacy is small. Infrastructure is made of steel and concrete. Intimacy is made of feelings. And while intimacy is abstract, infrastructure is brutally material. But recent work has significantly expanded the definition of infrastructure, making it more amenable to thought. Infrastructure, as some recent critics have it, is anything that enables the, quote, movement of people, goods, and information. So that means just about everything. Not only turbines, bridges, dams, subway lines, etc., but also protocols and standards, bureaucracy, bodily habits, political lobbies, behavioral norms, etc. David Kazanjian, in a recent article, refers to infrastructure as human relations congealed in material form, to give you a sense of, oh, thanks. So I don't get too congealed in my throat. I'm going to have some water. To give you a sense of the sort of reach of this new field, and I think also, something I think that it does quite well is to combine the new materialism with the old materialism, which is something we've all been trying to sort of think through a bit in the field. Despite the association with mere matter, then, critics now find that infrastructure is good to think with. The relation between intimacy and infrastructure has had a long history in queer studies. In her 2016 Signs article, The Infrastructure of Intimacy, R. Wilson describes how infrastructures, quote, infrastructure shapes the conditions of relational life. She writes that social forces, quote, produce private, proximate, and personal domains and distribute resources unequally across differently valued relations. The unequal value assigned to different forms of relations and the material consequences of that differentiation are absolutely essential to queer activism and queer thought. And I don't need to tell you guys this, but is exactly what we're dealing with right now. We have to double down on that form of thought. In the face of sweeping crises of provision, it might seem obvious that defending and bolstering infrastructure is our most urgent task. Yet there is no consensus among queer critics about the need for infrastructure. Although infrastructural analysis is key to queer studies, and has been for a long time, I think, the ideological spectrum of queer critics extends all the way from institutionalism to abolitionism. While some now see the need to shore up the infrastructures of queer life, others see the breakdown of infrastructure as an opportunity to rekindle the radical political dreams of queerness. In thinking through such questions, I followed the editors of a 2015 special issue of Modern Fiction Studies called Infrastructuralism. The editors underlined the, quote, difference between the planned violence of infrastructures of control and coercion, often imposed from above in the interests of power, and the infrastructures of provision and entitlement, often demanded from below. Such a distinction is crucial in making sense of the place of infrastructure in queer thought, but while underlining such a distinction, infrastructures of provision, infrastructures of control, clarifies the problem, it does not solve it. Attending to the contradictory and contested place of infrastructure in queer thought, so exacerbated right now, is the burden of my talk tonight. Okay. So, as I said, the definition of infrastructure has really expanded across the humanities in recent years. That's what's allowed people to think about it. But there's also been a sort of move to think about infrastructure as good for method, good for thinking new forms of methodology. Era Wilson, who I mentioned before, who's written a lot about infrastructure, comments that critics use infrastructure both as an object of research, a referent, a thing in itself, and at the same time as a rubric, a concept to facilitate critical analysis. The turn to infrastructure chimes with a turn to material forms of analysis across fields, a kind of turn away from purely linguistic analysis toward an attention to material symbolic systems, thinking of archive studies, affect studies, trans materialisms, disability studies, but also actor network theory, materialist media studies, and we could go on. For David Alf, thinking through infrastructure allows us to adjudicate questions of priority and framing, to historicize the machinery that moves objects to the foreground and background of a cultural stage, and to expose the ideological forces that make certain things seem like topics and others merely context. Critics have also considered infrastructure in its relation to intimate life. Notable in this is Brian Larkin, who talks about the poetics of infrastructure, and he traces the relationship between infrastructure and the history of the senses, arguing that infrastructure encodes, this is a quote, encodes the dreams of individuals and societies, and are the vehicles whereby those fantasies are transmitted and made emotionally real. Larkin offers, as an example, Walter Benjamin and his writing on the Paris arcades and railways, suggesting how histories of intimate experience get mixed up with the built environment. But moving from the enchanted infrastructures of the late 19th century to the crumbling infrastructures of the early 21st, it may be hard to see infrastructure as an object of collective fantasy. In fact, for Bruce Robbins, writing in 2007, the problem with infrastructure is that it is, quote, the object of no one's desire. In The Smell of Infrastructure, Robbins identifies the commodity as the object of a collective fantasy and contrasts it with infrastructure. Infrastructure enables the production, circulation, and consumption of commodities, but it's too big to fit in any shop window. Robbins continues, because it is not for sale, infrastructure is left to rot. So for Robbins, the response to such abandonment should be a reinvestment in public works and in the very idea of the public. But the abandonment of infrastructure fuels a cycle of neglect, both intellectual and material. But as Robbins points out, this demands a recalibration of our critical practice. He writes, "The privatizing of water has at least as good a claim as the panopticon to stand for what is most wrong with the world in the present time." So Robbins compares the privatization of water to Foucault's panopticon to make a distinction between traditional cultural studies, quote, concerned with the violence of the state and infrastructure and an infrastructural analysis which would attend to the goods that we cannot do without and that are best provided by the state. The branch of cultural studies, of course, most concerned with the panopticon, Foucault, and the power of the state, well, I'll argue, is queer studies. It's also true that the field hasn't had much to say about the provision of water. And yet, despite its concern with state surveillance and control, queer studies has also strongly opposed privatization, neoliberal privatization, dedicated itself to the thought of the public and become deeply invested over, I think decades in the concept of infrastructure. And this, I think, long predates the so-called infrastructural turn, which we are having. So just the opposition between the infrastructures of provision and infrastructures of control, I think, is very important, but it also breaks down in the context of queer thought, which has emphasized the entanglement of state violence and state provision. Such as the queer reading of Foucault, which understands the panopticon as both enabling and violent. Queer critics read the panopticon at the juncture of intimacy and infrastructure as an architecture of subjection. For Foucault and his queer readers, Bentham's prison models how state power is internalized and becomes the very substance of our interior lives. This is, I think, at the very heart of what queer studies does, and it involves trying to close the gap or think between intimacy and infrastructure, to think about law and love as part of the same moment, and to invent the methods that have helped us to do that. And to give you an example, just to think through, consider the queer critique of marriage and the infrastructural account of marriage, the infrastructural critique of marriage. So a structural analysis of marriage we can't do without. It embeds the institution in the history of white supremacy, eugenics, class hierarchy. But an infrastructural analysis adds to this consideration marriage, thinking about marriage in terms of domestic architecture, tax law, transportation networks, redlining, insurance protocols, communication networks, settlement patterns, welfare policy, and in Beth Freeman's phrase, the wedding complex. Such an analysis addresses the puzzling gap between love and desire on the one hand and bourgeois hegemony and racial capitalism on the other. Infrastructure constitutes a significant realm of mediation where large-scale social forces are operationalized, or, as Lauren Berlant puts it, infrastructure is the living mediation of what organizes life, the life world of structure. However, pointing to the methodological affordances of infrastructure does not resolve the question of its political significance or value. Again, the example of Foucault is instructive here. Foucault is a deeply infrastructural thinker who analyzes bureaucracy, architecture, and institutions, and who takes his image of power as an extensible network from the material form of infrastructure. But the infrastructural nature of his thought is bound up, of course, with a powerful, thoroughgoing critique of infrastructure. So thinking with infrastructure does not necessarily mean approving of infrastructure. And I think we can see the power and ambivalence of infrastructure across the history of queer criticism. And I'm just thinking about some major titles in the field: Sex in Public, Loving in the War Years, How to Have Promiscuity in an Epidemic, Toby Beacham's work on bathrooms, borders, and biometrics, Lucas Crawford on transgender plumbing, or Joan Lubin and Jean Vaccaro on the sexological floor plan. Across this work, it remains difficult to distinguish between infrastructures of control and those of provision. Provision may only come by way of control, if it comes at all. The question of access to clean water versus mass incarceration, just for instance, presents an impossible choice. And to the extent that it asks us to choose between support for the public good and a critique of what is, it is also a fool's choice. The recent tendency to understand critical debates in terms of stark either-or choices, critique versus post-critique, queer negativity versus world building, the antisocial thesis versus queer kinship, joy, and sociality, it's severely limiting this habit of mind, and it also puts us at odds with what has been most productive in the field. By contrast, I want to argue that in the infrastructure that are closest to us, we can't be for or against them. I mean this in a strategic and an existential sense as well. There are, strictly speaking, no infrastructures of provision or infrastructures of control, though we could certainly argue some limit cases. Infrastructures are enabling, and they do violence. So we may argue about whether it is now necessary to build up strong state provisions, or given the violence of the state, we must move provision outside of the ambit of the state. And I'm thinking here of Dean Spade's recent work on mutual aid as an important example. I'll come back to this point, this sort of impasse. But first I want to address a different tradition of thinking about infrastructure, which unfolds it at a smaller scale and concerns what is closest to hand. So I'm thinking, as I was in Underdogs, of the floor plans that are produced in Esther Newton's ethnography of drag bars, Mother Camp, and in Laud Humphrey's observation in public restrooms, tea room trade, which suggests that the social and sexual interaction in these spaces was determined by their layout. I want to extend this tradition of thinking about infrastructure in a practical and material sense by looking back to two Kessler lectures now available because of these amazing books that have been published. Gayle Rubin's 2003 lecture entitled Geologies of Queer Studies, It's Deja Vu All Over Again, and Samuel R. Delaney's 1997 lecture, 3-to-1 Contact. Both Rubin and Delaney were central to the genealogical work that I did in Underdogs about the significance of empirical social science to the development of queer theory. I'm therefore especially alert to the significance of infrastructure in their work. I understand them as engaged in an under-recognized left political project of stabilizing marginal social worlds, and that project needs infrastructure. So Rubin's lecture emphasizes knowledge infrastructure. She has argued throughout her career for the need to establish durable structures for the transmission of queer knowledge. It's Deja Vu All Over Again, once again, calls out the forgetting that has characterized the field, and Kaji actually spoke to this this, in I thought, very pressing ways in relationship to the field of trans studies. The forgetting that has characterized the field of LGBTQ plus studies. Rubin's concern is not with what is hidden from history so much as it is with what historians and others have discovered and then has been overlooked, neglected, or become inaccessible. Forgetting, in Rubin's view, is not an individual failing, a matter of bad scholarship or intellectual laziness. Rather, remembering is a collective task, one which requires not inconsiderable material resources. A major problem, Rubin writes, is that we still lack sufficient organizational resources to routinize the conservation of previously attained knowledge and their conveyance to new generations. Rubin emphasizes the need to build and sustain robust infrastructures for such knowledge. And the things that she's talking about are archives, libraries, curricula, programs, and departments. As an example of the instability of queer knowledge, Rubin points to her own early experiences trying to learn about the gay and lesbian past. So during college, Rubin visited Boston, where she went to, as she writes, I accidentally stumbled across a copy of the homophile publication, The Ladder, in a small bookshop near Harvard Square. I immediately wrote a letter to The Ladder explaining that I was working on a bibliography of lesbian literature and asking if anyone there could help. The editor was one Jean Damon, who was, of course, Barbara Greer. She replied with a sharp rebuke, informing me that such a bibliography already existed. That was The Lesbian in Literature by Jean Damon, Greer's pseudonym, and Lee Stewart, published in 1967. I was also duly chastised for my ignorance of Jeanette Foster's even earlier book, Sex Variant Women in Literature, 1956. Despite feeling wounded by the force of Greer's mighty typewriter, and despite the continuing difficulties of accessing the materials that were named in the bibliographies, Rubin found her way back to the Labadie collection at the University of Michigan, and the rest is history. While the chanciness and misdirection involved in Rubin's research process might seem like only a reminder of the bad old days, there has been a lot of institutionalism in the meantime, as well as the development of not only programs, but also freestanding archives, libraries, museums, and so on. But Rubin insists that forgetting in the field is ongoing. Late in her Kessler lecture, she offers an example of LGBT plus infrastructural fragility, and she's talking about the disappearance of the women's community that led her originally to The Ladder, right, the women's bookstore. Rubin observes that by the late 1970s, there were dozens of feminist and lesbian newspapers, at least a dozen journals, several thriving feminist presses, and a network of local communities with significant public territory. Rubin writes, today, there is almost nothing left of that world. She notes that in San Francisco, most of the shops were in rented storefronts along a low-rent business corridor. When commercial rents began to skyrocket, these shops were driven out. Rubin continues, the built environment is expensive to obtain and challenging to maintain. Stability is resource intensive. Given such cautionary tales and Rubin's frustration at continually reinventing the wheel of queer knowledge, she calls for resources that will stably house queer knowledge and ensure its transmission across generations. Although progress has obviously been made, Rubin argues that there are still lapses that need to be addressed. She writes, The infrastructures of knowledge require physical space and durable organizational structures, offices, buildings, libraries, archives, departments, programs, centers, faculty lines, staff positions, and paychecks. We must work to accumulate more resources and build better bureaucracies. Now, this phrase, build better bureaucracies, hasn't had the staying power of some other queer anthem slogans. We'll get t-shirts made. Rubin herself points to the inimical relationship between queerness and bureaucracy, following up the series call with an acknowledgement of its strangeness. Rubin writes, many of us instinctively recoil from the idea of bureaucratization and consider it distasteful. Bureaucracies almost by default lack excitement, glamour, or charisma. We often live for fleeting intensities and charged moments and celebrate marginality as a kind of permanent desideratum. But if bureaucracy and routinization have their costs, so do marginality and charisma. Marginality and momentary excitements are intrinsically fragile, evanescent, and unstable. Part of the reason for our impaired memory of the older strata of queer knowledge is that the institutions and organizations that produce them are gone. Queer life is full of examples of fabulous explosions that left little or no detectable trace, or whose documentary and artifactual remains were never systematically assembled or adequately conserved. Despite the uncharismatic nature of the topic, Rubin persists, suggesting that whatever queer explosions might happen, their ability to make a difference depends on building durable structures to support them. Now, the sheer nerdiness of Rubin's argument on behalf of knowledge infrastructures, and I'm with her on this, presents a marked contrast with Samuel Delaney's case for infrastructure. He's talking about the infrastructure of public sex in his 1997 lecture 321 Contact, which anticipated the publication, as many of you will know, of Delaney's remarkable mashup of urban history, social theory, and memoir, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. His lecture offers a chronicle of public sex in and around the porn theaters in Times Square before the Giuliani cleanup. Given its topic, we might expect the lecture to be made up of fabulous explosions, the ones that Rubin sees as so essential to queer life. But this is not Delaney's approach. The experience of public sex was not a flash in the pan for Delaney. Rather, it constitutes a blueprint for a democratic society, one in which sex is, like other public utilities, widely available, more like the electrical grid than a lightning strike. Delaney signals this intention in the lecture's epigraph, which is taken from Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 1. The quote is, "But I tell you, my lord fool, out of this nettle, danger, we pluck this flower, safety." For Delaney, surveying the half-lit regions where public sex is possible, safety is the flower to be plucked from these risky circumstances. The citation may remind us of one of Delaney's key intertexts, Jane Jacobs' 1963 book on the life and death of great American cities, in which she suggested that safety was the flower to be plucked from neighborhoods, unplanned, crowded, aging, that were seen as disorganized and dangerous by planners intent on the suburbanization of city life. Throughout his Kessler presentation, Delaney emphasizes the importance of interclass contact and communication conducted in a mode of goodwill. That's Delaney. But recognizes that such contact is threatened by underlying class antagonism. Like Jacobs, Delaney seeks institutions and social practices that will mitigate such conflict and enable cross-class interaction. In addition to class antagonism, such practices also face threats from above, that Delaney discusses, writing, "In the name of safety, society dismantles the various institutions that promote interclass communication, attempts to critique the way such institutions functioned in the past to promote their happier side. Such attempts are often seen as a pernicious glorification of everything dangerous, unsafe sex, neighborhoods filled with undesirables, read unsafe characters, promiscuity, and an attack on the family and the stable social structure with dangerous, non-committed, unsafe relationships. That's to say, those not modeled on the bourgeois notion of monogamous marriage held up in their place." Delaney echoes the infrastructural thinking of Jacobs while moving her advocacy on behalf of urban density, street life, and mixed-use neighborhoods in the direction of intimacy. The intimacy of infrastructure for Delaney partly recalls Benjamin writing on the Paris arcades. Urban infrastructure, such as the nickel subway fare or the corner peep show, recall an entire world of sensual memory and fantasy. But that intimacy is also of the carnal kind, since we can assume that at least some of these unsafe characters are the kind that Delaney himself would like to meet. In his account of the destruction of the old Times Square with its institutions of public sex, Delaney offers a textbook example of what R.L. Wilson describes as the differential distribution of resources across differently valued kinds of relation. When your very existence and way of life are understood as an attack on the family and the stability of society itself, the institutions that serve you hardly even count as institutions. This is key to Delaney's point. Along with a critique of heteronormativity, which he clearly is making, he offers very specific thoughts and directives about how to build up institutions of queer life. The freedom, he writes, to be gay without robust gay institutions is meaningless. This is Delaney. Many gay institutions, clubs, bars in several persuasions, baths, tea room sex, gay porn, movie houses, brunches, that's a good one, entertainment, cruising areas, truck stop sex, circuit parties, and many more have grown up outside the knowledge of much of the straight world. But these institutions have nevertheless grown up very much within our society, not outside it. They do not propagate insanely in some extra-social and unconstrained outside beyond, apart from any concept of social responsibility, and that includes what goes on in the orgy rooms at the baths. For Delaney, many aspects of gay life, even those considered wild and uncontrolled, are situated squarely within the social. Less an identity than a form of social participation, gayness for Delaney is a matter of infrastructure. Okay, this is my conclusion. Rubin's infrastructure of queer knowledge and Delaney's institutions for public sex land for us today as examples of good infrastructure, infrastructures of provision, infrastructures from below that build up queer life in the mode of goodwill. Looking back at other Kessler lectures, we see other examples of scholars and activists who depend on this kind of infrastructure, who want it. We might think of Joan Nessel speaking in 1992 about her work with Mabel Hampton, enabled as it was by training workshops in doing oral histories that she took around New York City, as well, of course, as by the existence of the Lesbian Herstory Archive. Or we can think of Edmund White describing feminist conscience-raising groups as the inspiration for his autobiographical novels. We might also consider Adrienne Rich's 2006 reflections on feminist print culture as providing an intellectual infrastructure for queer thought. This is Rich. I've been thinking how behind every shelf of publications on gender and sexuality, every course offered in queer or gender studies, lie thousands of ghostly sheaves, leaflets, letters, pamphlets, mimeographed bibliographies, little magazines, posters, movement anthologies, some now preserved in archives and others reduced to landfill. I also want to draw attention to Cheryl Clark, speaking in 2013. She was remembering the university. She was talking about the university as an infrastructure that would support queer life. Clark describes her arrival at Rutgers in 1969, quote, "I landed in New Brunswick on the Rutgers campus, met by the ballyhoo of a full gamut of political demonstrations by students and faculty, anti-war, Black Power, women's liberation, gay liberation, and the kindness of, shall we say, strangers, all in jeans and t-shirts." Rutgers is, in Clark's memory, a whole world replete with opportunities for intellectual, political, and sexual awakening. We might regret the difference between 1969 and 2024. We can point to the corporatization of the university, the incorporation of difference in diversity work, or the recent crackdown on student protests. Yet, despite the changes affecting higher education today, it would be wrong, I think, not to credit the university as one of the key institutions supporting queer life. And I'll just point to myself as someone who definitely has a homosexuality of the university. I know you're out there. One of the most significant critiques of the contemporary university in its role as queer infrastructure has been made by 2020 Kessler winner Roderick A. Ferguson. Ferguson has argued that diversity work in higher education is a form of institutional capture. The incorporation of difference represents a break with the goals of the new social movements and a realignment with the goals of the corporate interests of the university. The utopian space that makes an appearance in Ferguson's Kessler lecture is not this Rutgers campus in 1969, but the free household run by members of STAR, or the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, in this, and he writes, in this lumpen household filled with queens who floated from room to room and with puppies that played and snuggled, Ferguson suggests, quote, we might find our model and inspiration. The Star household gives a glimpse of what can be done outside of infrastructure and the radical possibilities of infrastructure that is truly from below. And this inspires Ferguson because he says that folks really do refuse to give up before they get what they really want, what they really need. And I think there is inspiration here, and I'm very moved by Ferguson's argument, just because I have, as you guys have heard, I've been doing this kind of internalist history of queer studies in relation to the university, the institution, the history of the disciplines, and so on. And I do understand the critique of that work as a form of institutional capture in itself, right? You're not doing the movement work, you're studying the history of queer studies. Yet, that work in Underdogs and elsewhere was an attempt to get real about the material and institutional conditions of our knowledge production. It was an attempt to think about the situation of queer studies inside the academy, And I've been very influenced by Gayle Rubin's call to build up infrastructures of queer knowledge and transmission. But I have to say that the entanglement of that activity with my own professional life and with a highly capitalized university is impossible to ignore. But how am I going to land this, right? The university is, for me, as it is for many of us, the infrastructure that is closest at hand. And it is, I would say, for many of us, also what we know of the public. The extreme unevenness of higher education, brought home with such clarity and force in Matt Brim's Poor Queer Studies, makes it difficult to generalize. But for many of us and for our students, undoubtedly the university has enabled material, intellectual, and political flourishing. It has also been a place of danger. We have had to pluck the flower of safety from this nettle. But this is what we do. And I know that the work that all of you are doing to try to make your campuses the kind of places that Cheryl Clark arrived at in 1969 is considerable. In a 2021 CLAGS Roundtable, Histories of Queer and Trans Scholarship, Ferguson insists on the need to build up para-academic structures. He argues one way of invoking our queer and trans ancestors would be to build more para-academic spaces, to actively see the constitution of alternative spaces in institutional formations as completely in line with what people were doing in 1969 and onward. This should become part of our queer and trans social practice. Okay, I can't think of any better example of this than CLAGS. CLAGS has built up, shored up a marginal social world over the almost 40 years of its history. And it has had a commitment during this time to both queer knowledge and politics. CLAGS is an infrastructure from below and an academic infrastructure. It is made of friendship, love, and hundreds of hours of volunteer labor. But it's also made of emails, meeting rooms, servers, presses, publications, and memos. During its nearly 40-year history, and you learn this from the Kessler lectures themselves, it has served as a movement space, a free university, and a scene of queer sociality. So I've taken the research for tonight's presentation from these two recently published books, thanks to the Feminist Press, thanks to the editors, Queer Ideas, and Queer Then and Now. These are amazing books. And there is really a history of queer studies in there. The experience of the existence of these volumes, as well as the yearly Kessler lecture itself, and everyone's presence here tonight, is, I think, shows us what is possible at the intersection of infrastructure and intimacy. So we come together to honor the collective work of all those who've built CLAGS. They made a world for us. And I think it's hard times now, and we're gonna have to really turn up for CLAGS now. And I think we do that in the spirit of mutual aid, with love and friendship and care, and we do it in the spirit of infrastructure by building it up and reinforcing it with paychecks and the bureaucratic know-how that we all do have. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to take some, this is my sister's joke. I'm going to take some LGBTQ&A. Thank you, Megan Love. For anybody who has a question or a comment.
I just think that we should have a round of applause for the signers tonight.
That's All Hands in Motion. They are incredible. They're here all the time. They nail it. They're great.
Sorry, I can't, it's really hard to see in the crowd, so if you could just say your name. I knew that voice because that's my mother's voice, so that one I was clear on, but
I'm sorry, say who I am?
just say your name, yeah.
Yeah, I'm Yonina Hoffman. I'm just jumping right in, so I apologize. This is somewhat of a minimal question, but a lot of the examples of infrastructure that you've been considering, especially with respect to encounters and the intimacy that they provide, is physical. And I'm wondering if you would reflect a little bit on the changed nature of infrastructure and intimacy in the world of the digital.
Yeah, I mean, I'm maybe not the best person to answer that question. You probably have more thoughts about it because, you know, I'm old and you know, my intimacy is much more in person than it is online. But, you know, I mean, you know, I was getting some mileage out of these jokes about infrastructure being made of concrete and steel, but, you know, infrastructure, I mean, it's made of cables, right? It's made of servers, it's made of terminals, right? So the digital infrastructure itself, right? That's like I think that's, you know, I'm naming, you know, climate change and the destruction of the federal bureaucracy as kind of reasons why people are thinking about it. But I do think that the sort of, that, you know, thinking about what infrastructure, I'm dodging your question, I realize, but I do have something to say. That, you know, I think that thinking about infrastructure and what I'm sort of characterizing is this, this thought that I think is valuable because it sort of, it carries the charge of older forms of materialism, Marxism, and so on, but it also gets at some of the liveliness of matter kind of discourse. And I do think that thinking about the sort of complexity of digital networks and their, you know, materialization, just as hardware and software is like that in itself is good to think with. So that's not your question, but it does occur to me as something I didn't really talk about, but I think is important. You know, I mean, I do think it's sort of generational. I don't mean to dodge it even further to say it's generational, but I do think that, you know, this stuff about Benjamin and the railroad, right? It is, or Benjamin's whole writing on childhood, or Adorno's writing on childhood. You know, it's about the sort of moment in technology that you were a child, grew up in. And so, you know, it's like I got my first AOL account, I made good use of it, but in like, you know, when I was like 21. So I have a very different, my intimate relationship to the internet is extremely different from people who, you know, obviously had, you know, much different forms of access to it. But, you know, you make the best of what you have, I think. And Pearl, are you here? I thought Pearl was here. Anyway, she what? She just went to she stepped out. Okay, yeah, I don't want to embarrass her, but we Pearl, are you there? You are there. Okay, I can't see your hand, but you're there. Because I've just given an example of like my experience of digital intimacy. I mean, obviously, you know, I did cocktails during Zoom or whatever, but Pearl and I taught that wasn't very intimate, but Pearl and I taught a queer studies class together at Penn online, and it was actually maybe the best class I've ever taught. I mean, all props to Pearl, but there was something about the form of the class, and we were actually, you know, the class was happening in Philadelphia, and Pearl was living in Berlin, and I was living in Copenhagen, and somehow we felt so close to those students, and and they were willing to share so much stuff with us, and it was like, I don't know, it's just it was, partly had to do with the stripping away of the whole world, but I was, I'd have always, of course, been like, you have to teach in person, like, you have to like see the surround of the seminar room and all that. I mean, I do believe in that, but we had a really vital experience of that. So that's not really, again, an answer, but these are just some thoughts I have about that question. Hey, Sarah. Thanks for that $250, by the way.
So I was just thinking, when you were talking about both Gayle Rubin's and some of Lainey's talks, how much that's connected with, or how different it is from now with the unaffordability of living in a city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I know, at least in my own experience living in New York in the late 80s, that a lot of the activism that happened during those days, at least in New York and San Francisco, was made possible by the fact that you could have a part-time job and afford your rent.
Mm-hmm.
So you could go to meetings, you could go to demonstrations in the middle of the day, you could do art projects or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the same thing with women's bookstores, or, oh, now it's on, thank you, that you needed cheap space, and that is just not possible anymore. And I know there's a lot of talk about like, oh, the internet, it's, broken queer community and blah, blah, blah. But I think so much of it is about the unaffordability of urban space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the moment we're in now, and I'm thinking actually of Sarah Schulman's talk, where, she pointed to, and what we have, even more now, which is this sort of, the kind of luxury blight, right? So that all these storefronts can't, I was just in the East Village, there's just empty storefront after empty storefront after empty storefront. And it's not even that like people can just use that space because it's essentially free, right? The owners are holding on and waiting for more people who can afford it. So I'm just thinking as someone who's lived in New York since 1983, so I've seen a lot of that change. Yeah. How do we build a physical queer infrastructure in urban spaces when living and thriving in an urban space has become almost impossible for anyone except the very rich?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to invite all you guys to move to West Philly and join the movement. Yeah, we got West Philly in the house. No, it's a great question, and it's part of the. I don't know what. Well, I'll just use trip. I'll just use David's language again. It's part of the trip of CLAGS, too, right? Because, I was coming to CLAGS. I was coming to the Kessler lecture, from UVA. Where my graduate fellowship was $8,000 a year, right? It's like, since, I went to grad school in '96, like New York was always already, like I didn't live in the glory days of when it was affordable. Like it was always the expensive place that I couldn't really afford to be or whatever. And I think the whole moment in queer studies, which we haven't really talked about, I guess Cindy touched on it a bit, of the sort of, the kind of anti-metropolitan, like, rural queer studies, like, because I used to come and be like, at first when I was working in the furniture store, I was like, I really like, I really like theory and literature, but I'm not the right kind of person to go to grad school. This is my, like, class anxiety about going to, I was like, I'm not a professor. And then I got to be a professor, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to make it in queer studies because it's, like, too glamorous, and I can't live in Charlottesville, Virginia. I need to live in New York and whatever. So, and that's, I don't know how, I think those sort of feelings produced around this as, like, as I said, like, I think the model of a democratic of a democratic institution, and, like, there's not, like, free universities anymore, like, anywhere, right? Like, and one of the things of reading through the Kessler lectures is you just read such amazing accounts of people being like, well, this was my education, right? Or, Dean Spade saying, Urvashi Spade gave me my first computer so I could go to law school, right? It's truly an amazing space, and yet I wonder how this location plays in the minds of people, in all of these different kind of historical layers, right? That would be an interesting sociological project for me to think about that. But, for me, the main thing now is the infrastructural point of we just have to keep it going, right? And I think, Matt's comments about, CUNY's going to completely cut funding, the state's going to completely cut funding to CLAGS, but there's the building, right? And this is a magical space for me. It's a weird space, but it's magical. And, as long as, maybe they're going to move, I don't know, but it's the building is sort of, its temporality is different from other things. And that's what infrastructure is like, and that's why we need endowments for Black studies, and that's why we need to invest, right, in these structures that are not fleeting, right, that they have some kind of staying power. So I didn't really answer your question, but I think it's an important one. It's it's important, I think, also about the sort of the sort of place of New York in the reality and the imagination of queer studies, and of course bigger than that, of the U.S. in the global economy of history of sexuality. Those are all things to think about. Yeah. I'm good. Yeah, no, I don't need to keep talking. It's fine. Let's party. But you want to close this out?
Everybody help me. Congratulate you. I am supposed to say something. I'm going to read it on my phone. If you are in the room and you donated online $25 or more, please stop at the donation station up here in the Elebash lobby to get your sexy CLAGS tote. You won't be able to get it downstairs because they don't have the data that they need to confirm that you did that. But thank you. If you gave, we have made tonight, and I believe this is mostly from online viewers, not in the room viewers, we made $1,945, to which we add the $1,500 matching, and so however much that is, $3,500 about, we made tonight. Please continue, if you're at home, to contribute over the next 2 weeks, and actually through the end of the year is when our fundraiser runs until. If you're in the room and did not get a chance to give online, because that's hard to do in the moment, you have pledge cards in your hands. You don't have to give tonight, but you can pledge to give and we'll contact you, or you can put a check in that envelope and put it in the box on the donation station table, or you can put cash, and just be sure that you put that in the box if you put cash in the envelope. We have a few people to thank. Behind me, you'll see this building, the Graduate Center, as well as a lot of offices and departments in the building. Really special thanks to Austin Svedjan for creating the incredible infrastructure, intimacy and infrastructure poster. Heather has signed those, and those are again available when you donate. Mostly, thank you everybody here for your attendance. We could have all the money in the world, but if we don't have you, if we don't have you in these seats, if you don't have you giving us ideas and contributing to the knowledge base that we create here together, there would be no reason for CLAGS to exist. We really appreciate your time. One more time, Heather, congratulations. The 2024 David R. Kessler winner, Heather Love. There is food downstairs. It's the concourse
Before
level.
that, I don't think we could have done this without the volunteer labor of all the board members here behind the scenes. Please give a shout out to Connor, Thomas Reed, all doctors. So yeah, so Shoham, Ray, and Smaran, like everybody. Just look at our board of directors. Everybody was here. This is all free labor. And thank you all. And we do it. It's a labor of love. We are trying to build the infrastructure. But most importantly, all our staff members, all our interns, everybody was here tonight just to make this possible. And we are here all the nights that we have programming. And of course, thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. You'll know them because they'll have name tags on, and they'll want to talk to you as much as you want to talk to them. Please join us for the reception on the concourse level. You just go out the Elebash doors, take a left, and you'll see elevator banks that go to C. We'll be down there to talk and to tell you the story of CLAGS even more. Thank you so much.